the build-up. This is a Coleman family tree. It can be, since they repeated the same names in every generation, it can be difficult sometimes to sort out who's related exactly to whom. So hopefully this will be some help. I'll try to refer to it as I'm giving the talk. I think the title of the talk is The Colemans and St. Luke's Church. So that's what I'm going to concentrate on. I apologize to Catherine. I think she's heard some of this before, but it's been a while. Any other Episcopalians here besides Catherine? Sorry. No, that's fine. You're the only Episcopalian I know of who's here.
Yes.
Yes. Any Presbyterians? Okay, because we're going to be referring to the Presbyterians a lot also, and I don't want to offend anyone. I don't think I'm going to say anything negative about them, but just wanted to make sure. The Coleman family in America, the founder of the Coleman family is Robert Coleman, at the head of your family tree. He was born in 1748 in Northern Ireland, in Ulster, and he came to this country in 1764. He had had some education in math, so he was hired as a clerk in various organizations, and finally by James Old at some of his iron furnaces, including Speedwell Forge and Reading Furnace. In 1773, he married his boss's daughter, Anne Old, and inherited Elizabeth Furnace and some of the properties, and they climbed the ladder of success. They were associated with St. James Episcopal Church in Lancaster. Anyone, there's a picture of Anne, we'll refer to her again. And that's not what St. James looks like now, but that's what it looked like back in his time. I only start back with St. James because I like to start at the beginning, and Anne and Robert were very zealous church members. And I think all of you know the story of his daughter Anne, their daughter Anne, who apparently committed suicide when her father refused to allow her to marry James Buchanan. And you may not know that another daughter, Sarah, apparently committed suicide also when the father refused to allow her to marry the rector at St. James, because he and William Augustus Muhlenberg disagreed on evening services. So they felt very strongly about the church. After he died, Robert Coleman died in 1825, his two sons, his sons inherited the direction of the iron furnaces and their iron properties. Hannah Cassatt was Presbyterian, so she raised her children. They were baptized in the Presbyterian church. We're on the right side now of the family tree. But as you can see, she died very young, and her husband died only 6 years later. So we're going to revert back to Anne, because she took over management of the property and of her grandchildren. And as they came of age, they were given the opportunity of remaining Presbyterian or rejoining the Episcopal Church, and all of them joined the Episcopal Church. So now we come to Lebanon. Lebanon County did not have an Episcopal Church. It was, as you know, Pennsylvania German. There were a lot of Lutheran, Reformed, Brethren, Mennonite congregations, but nothing as exotic as the Episcopal Church in Lebanon County. And I won't go into too much of the founding of this parish. The Grubb family of the Mount Hope estate gets the credit for nurturing this parish because Alfred Abel, when he graduated from seminary, the Bishop of Pennsylvania sent him out from Hope Church, which was the Grubb family church just over the line in Lancaster County, to found Episcopal churches in Lebanon County. so the first meeting of Episcopalians was on November 8, 1857, about a half a block from here, down Walton Street at 7th, in a parlor, in a house there. But apparently, within 2 or 3 weeks, their meetings were attracting 100, 150, 200 people. Even if they couldn't understand English, people seemed to be very curious about this new denomination. And at that point, the Colemans immediately become important in the history of the parish. William Coleman immediately bought land for the church. The church council, what we call the vestry, was not ready to build a building or purchase or go that far. So that offer was not taken up on immediately. That was on September 8, 1858. William Coleman was elected to the first vestry, the first church council, in 1858, and subscribed money toward the construction of a church. He asked permission to make arrangements with an architect in Philadelphia, John Knockman, and got plans for a church. The vestry decided that the project was too expensive, and it was turned down. They also didn't like the land he had bought for them, so he gave them stock in his railroads instead, that they could use to purchase land when they were ready to build a church. Unfortunately, he was already dying, and he died at Cornwall on May 24, 1861. At his death, the vestry, quote, resolved that we record with unfeigned sincerity our testimony to the uniform cleanliness of manner and the unvarying interest in all that concerned the affairs of this church, which always manifested itself in Mr. Coleman. We have lost a steady and friendly support in our work and a reverent worshiper in the services of our church. Since his children were infants, were very young, he arranged for his cousin, George Dawson Coleman, we're now on the left side, although he was a Presbyterian, to be elected to the vestry in his place. And with George in the leadership, the first building was built here. On March 23rd, 1863, they voted to buy land that were not quite standing on, a little bit to our left, and they approved plans to build a building. The new church was to be consecrated on St. Luke's Day in 1863. Now, who knows when St. Luke's Day is? Catherine does. Okay. If you're in the Lutheran Church, you may celebrate it occasionally when it falls on a Sunday. It's October 18th. Not a big day for other denominations, but for this parish, it's bigger than Christmas and Easter. I mean, I started here on a St. Luke's Day, and it was diving right into the fire. There was so much pageantry. We've cut back on that a lot since then. But it was a very important day for the church. It was, I'm sorry, I'm not keeping up here with George Dawson Coleman and William Coleman. The church was to be dedicated on St. Luke's Day in 1863, but it could not be dedicated until it was paid for, and they still were lacking $280. So, once again, the Coleman family came through. George Dawson and his mother, Harriet Dawson Coleman, subscribed the money, wrote the check in order that the church could be dedicated. Once it was dedicated, George Dawson Coleman declined re-election to the vestry, and the name Coleman disappears from the official records. But behind the scenes, Sue Ellen Litz Coleman was still a very important member of the parish. guess I should back up a little bit. The 1850s were a difficult time for the iron industry in this country because the British had perfected the anthracite-fired furnace, which was much more efficient than the coke-fired furnaces that were being used here. And so the price of iron fell through the floor, and William Coleman was looking for new business for the company in Savannah, Georgia, when he met a local woman, Sue Ellen Habersham, and they were married, and so that's how Sue Ellen becomes an important part of this parish. As you can see in the display case, St. Luke's was named for St. Luke's Church in Philadelphia. It was originally called Christ Church and renamed for St. Luke's. During the 1870s, while St. Luke's grew and prospered, Ellen and her children divided their time between Cornwall, New York, Savannah, and Europe. Their son, Robert, went off to school, Episcopal schools in Connecticut, and Ellen and her daughter returned to Cornwall. In 1877, she gave land for the Methodist Church in Cornwall, and to which Robert Mann gave a pipe organ in 1879. But for our purposes, the next important date is 1879, when Robert Habersham Coleman came into his inheritance. And there's a picture of Old St. Luke's and the rectory, the parsonage next door, and a picture of Sue Ellen. We'll get back to her a little bit later. 1879, Robert Habersham Coleman took over control of his properties, and immediately he embarked upon building a new building for St. Luke's. It's the building that you see to my left. The cornerstone was laid on St. Luke's Day in 1879, and it was dedicated on St. Luke's Day in 1880. Now, during this period also, I think you know the story of his first wife, Lilly. I'll briefly review that if you don't. She was a local girl from Hartford, Connecticut that he met in college, and once he had come into his inheritance, they were married. They went to Europe for an extended trip to pick furnishings for a mansion that he was building for her in Cornwall, and she died there in May of 1880. The church was being built at the time, and you probably have heard this also, but it is true that her remains were brought here to the building and placed in a crypt, which is under the high altar of the church. If any of you are interested in taking a tour afterward and you haven't seen the crypt and you'd like to, I'll be happy to show it to you. The body is not there anymore because after, of course, Robert was devastated by this loss, but after a few years, as you may have heard, his mother felt it was time for him to continue the dynasty, and so he married a young woman who had been raised with him and his sister. And once Edith was here, she said, I'm not taking communion over that woman's body. So Lily's remains were transferred to the family plot in Philadelphia. In 1889, Robert was listed in the New York Times as one of the 5 richest men in America, hard for me to believe with all the other robber barons living at the time. But the panic of 1893, of course, was devastating for his finances. In December of that year, he left Lebanon, never to return. Once the 1880 building was built, he was elected every year to the vestry, the church council. And even after he left, the vestry insisted on re-electing him as a member until 1910, when he finally said, look, I'm not coming back to Lebanon. and they made him an honorary member. But every year, when they notified him of his election, he would send a letter to them. And the one for 1909, I think is worth quoting. He writes, "Through your rector and various sources, I have followed the progress of the missions and of the parish and missions, and I desire to express at this time my hearty approval of what you have accomplished, as well as my congratulations at the steady advance of the real work and growth of the church plant. As I look back upon my boyhood days and think of the little brick chapel we used to worship in, it seems almost a miracle that such a splendid collection of grand buildings could have come to occupy the corner of the field outlying the small village, which no one in those days could have ever been bold enough to suggest would once have real value. Or who would assume the business and proportions of a city parish, or that the handful of church people surrounded by strong religious bodies could have expanded into a congregation of settled and of lasting proportions. No one can see such things over this broad land and not be convinced that the church is here to stay and that nothing will prevail against it." Now, after having dealt with Robert until his departure, I'd like to return to Sue Ellen because and go over some of her contributions to St. Luke's. In 1882, she enabled the parish to establish 4 reading rooms and recreation rooms for youth in Lebanon that became the nucleus of the Lebanon Public Library. Each location contained a reading room, recreation room, book room, and refreshment room. In 1883, the parish newsletter noted that the public library at 813 Cumberland continued its success. It has been open 3 times a week for 7 months. Over 2,000 books have been taken out in that time. She began a parochial school, which by 1883 included 4 schools with 160 scholars. Most of her work was done through the St. Catherine's Guild because the vestry was not allowed to elect women to its ranks. There was a request from some women for that, and they asked the chancellor of the diocese, the lawyer for the diocese, and he said that only citizens of Pennsylvania were eligible and women were not citizens of Pennsylvania. They were not voting citizens. So St. Catherine's Guild, a women's organization in the church, was the area through which they did most of their work. And of course, one of their many works was the Good Samaritan Hospital. Another one was the Children's Home in Jonestown, which Ellen purchased for the church, for the parish. That's a picture of the new building, the 1880 building. You can see the former, what they called then the chapel, and used it for Sunday school, in the courtyard beyond it. I don't know how well you can see that, but that's a picture of the interior of the church. A picture of another one of Robert's contributions to the parish, the Trinity Chapel on West Cumberland Street. A picture of Robert, and now Sue Ellen. The Good Samaritan Hospital began in a parish house and infirmary on Chestnut Street, and that's the picture of the original hospital. The rector of St. Luke's was the head of the board of directors in the early years of the church, and on an advisory board for the hospital included Mrs. Horace Brock, Deborah Norris Coleman Brock, as well as Horace Brock, Robert Haversham Coleman, G. Dawson Coleman. Ellen's death on April 22nd, 1892 was a major blow to the parish. The following resolution was adopted on her death, and I'm going to take just a few minutes to read this gives a sense of the person rather than just names and dates. For 35 years, she has been a member of St. Luke's Church, a constant attendant at all its services, an earnest communicant at its altar, a devoted supporter of all good works in the parish. We remember her when she came to this parish in her early married life in 1857. We recall her when she worshiped with us in a hall in this town, and then in the chapel, and later in the present beautiful edifice. And remember with pleasure the Christian interest and joy with which she entered into all the services of God's church. We recognize that the present noble church edifice is largely due to her exertions, and we have a constant reminder of her love for the beauty of the Lord's house visibly before our eyes in the font and in the eagle lectern and other articles for divine service given by her generosity and thoughtfulness. The weak and suffering in the parish were never forgotten by her, and of her time and pursuit, of her time and purse, she freely gave to the poor. In the young of the parish, she never failed to manifest her interest, frequently called them together for instruction, and was constantly thoughtful in providing entertainments for them. The 4 parish schools which she established were a favorite field of labor, and she provided for their support for 22 years, during which time 1,500 children passed under the charge of 4 teachers to whom she committed their instruction. 12 years ago, she initiated the church home at Jonestown to further shelter and educate orphans and friendless children, an institution which has extended its administrations to the whole diocese and has provided for 60 inmates. It is vain to try to record how many were her works among us or express how much she will be missed. The public reading room, the Women's Guild, the Sewing Society, the Boy Choir, the Sunday School, the Church Home for Orphans, the hospital and its dispensary, and every department of church work bear witness to her exertions and will be the weaker for her absence. The church at large will miss her, for in every work of the diocese and in every department of missions, she manifested a living interest and gave with great liberality to their support. For Christian graciousness, Mrs. Coleman was remarkable, and in every good work was so done as to be twice valued on account of the rare grace of manner with which she performed them. In the things which concern the peace of the congregation, Mrs. Coleman was most preeminent, and we know no one who better exemplified the words of the apostle, to follow after the things which make for peace and things wherewith one may edify another. This has much strengthened the parish. Her faith, love, works, and graciousness were things of our experience for well nigh 40 years, and we bless God for these and all virtues as rays of Christ's light He has made manifest in His saints, the Spirit. Now, after the Colemans left, the benefaction of the parish fell to the Freeman family, which you can see on the right side of your family tree. William Coleman, or Freeman, was a cousin of Robert Habersham Coleman and a rival, as you may know from reading local history. But after Robert left the area, Isabel Coleman Freeman and Margaret Coleman Freeman Buckingham took his place as benefactors for the parish. There you go. The building you're in was given by Margaret and Isabel in 1902, and I've been told that I need to wrap up, so I'm going to. Their gifts to the parish were ongoing. She also was a benefactor of the Washington National Cathedral in Washington because she had her townhouse there. And on her death, the vestry also memorialized her many contributions. Now, because of your interests, I'm going to skip down, finally, to the Brocks. You're familiar, of course, with Horace Brock and Deborah Norris Coleman Brock. There's a picture, I think, of some of you. story I want to pass along to you on the Colemans. In 1902, Deborah and Horace decided to give the church silver candlesticks for the altar in honor of their silver wedding anniversary. And that was at the time that this building we're in was being built by Margaret and Isabel. When the rector told Margaret about this gift, Margaret wrote a letter to the vestry in which she said, "We've received a visit from Mr. Page who told us that Mr. and Mrs. Horace Brock offered to give St. Luke's Church altar lights on the anniversary of their silver wedding, and that the vestry had bet on whether or not to accept this gift. Feeling as strongly as we do on this subject, we are compelled to express to the vestry in writing that we have already told Mr. Page that we entirely disapprove of altar lights as well as other ritualistic practices which have lately been introduced into the service of the church. We do not know the attitude of the vestry in this matter, but to prevent any misunderstanding, wish our position to be clearly defined. We are distinctly opposed to ritualism in any form. We know that at least one member of the vestry, Mr. Robert Coleman, would feel exactly as we do. We trust that matters will not go to the point where we will be forced to withdraw our support and leave the church." So obviously the vestry declined Horace and Deborah's gift of candlesticks. But things obviously were patched up later because in 1914, Deborah and Margaret and Isabel joined their forces to purchase a new organ for the parish, and these are pipe cases from that instrument in 1914. And about that same time, Deborah and Horace succeeded in donating candlesticks for the altar. The final gift from the Brocks is beneath us. If you take a tour of the church, I will show you the chapel in this building. Contains paneling from their home in Coleman's Park when the mansions were demolished. The family offered anything that the parish could use from their house, and the paneling was used for the chapel. So Margaret and Isabel supported the church until their deaths, and then their place was taken by William Coleman Freeman, Jr., who continued to serve in the church until his death. And when the mansion was sold to the Methodist Church for Cornwall Manor, a fraction of the proceeds was given to St. Luke's for the endowment fund. So we still have endowments from several of the Freeman heirs. Any questions?
Yes, he was very gracious. They asked him to present for 20 minutes and then accept questions from the floor. So if you have questions, please do raise them at this time. Okay, then I guess any closing comments would be fine. You're so thorough.
Well, I try. The final portion of this building complex is behind us. That wing was not part of Margaret and Isabel's parish house. It was constructed in 1915, about 13 years later, as a men's club, and that was while John Pembroke was president of the men's club. He was also responsible for the lighting in the church when the church finally was wired for electricity in 1911.
Well, these are the people that have Coleman's Park, the Brocks and that.
Right.
Now, with that church there, That's a Presbyterian, well, it was.
Yeah.
My wife now.
Yeah, it was a Presbyterian church. Thank you for bringing that up. That was Christ Presbyterian. It was founded by George Dawson Coleman's wife in 1857, and that branch of the family was very active there. When it was sold, 2 or 3 years ago, the new congregation was not really interested in its history, and so you'll see one of their sons, James Coleman, 1860 to 74. He died. He was thrown from a horse when he was horseback riding out near Elizabeth Furnace, and the Coleman Chapel there on 501 was built at the place where he died. Another memorial to James Coleman was a baptismal font, was carved of Carrara marble and put in Christ Presbyterian. When this new congregation bought it, Christ Presbyterian asked if we would take the memorial because of our association with the Colemans. So that's the latest addition to our church is the marble baptismal font from Christ Presbyterian.
So you also have a room full of historical documents behind this wall?
Right.
Can you talk about what you found in those?
Well, when I first started my interest in the archives here, I was a little dismayed not to find many early records until I happened online to see that they were deposited in the state archives. So I went to the state archives and had copies made of all of them. So we have copies of the original records. We actually have some original letters from Robert Coleman and several of the Colemans. And of course we have the various church records, the records of the orphanage in Jonestown, the records from Trinity Chapel on West Cumberland Street, and various church organizations.
And can you, if you already said this, I apologize, but can you talk, was it Anne that's buried or was buried under the steps? Is she still there? Where is she?
Okay, I'm sorry, I'll repeat that. Maybe I said it too quickly. It was Lilly Coleman, was Robert's first wife, was interred. There was a service conducted in the undercroft in the basement, which did exist, and then workmen were there and they built a crypt around the coffin. And the body remained there for several years until Robert's second wife objected because she had been raised with Robert and he knew how much he loved Lilly, and so she objected to the body being there where he could go and meditate and whatever, and so the remains were removed to Philadelphia, to Laurel Hill Cemetery.
Philadelphia, okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So now Robert's remains are between Lily's remains and Edith's remains, his two wives.
Wow, thank you.
At the Laurel Hill Cemetery.
In Philadelphia, yeah.
Now, James Coleman, he's over at St. James, the church in Lancaster. He's buried there, him and his wife and a few, because Liz and I were over there already, in the courtyard, St. James.
Right, Robert Coleman
Yes.
is buried at St. James,
Yes.
yes. Mm-hmm.
And his wife and had a couple of children. I can't remember.
Well, then I
They're
can,
in there.
thank you. I can only say thank you so much. This
Did
was
you have
so.
a question?
Oh, I missed that.
I just wondered if there's still any living descendants from Robert and Anne.
Yes.
Yes, both of them have descendants. Both of them have descendants. Robert had, I think, 5 sons, Robert and Edith. Several of them died fairly young. One died, I think, in Panama of yellow fever. But there are still descendants until Anne died in 1934. Whenever St. Luke's got a new rector, a new pastor, he was introduced to the family so that the family would have a connection with the parish, and the rector at St. Luke's always was present at funerals of any Colemans who died. I've had a visit from one of the descendants. I gave a tour of the church not too many years ago. So while they don't have a great interest in the church, they still recognize the connection.
Yeah, they have Elizabeth Farms there now.
Okay, they still own, yeah, they still own property in this area,
They still
yes.
have the Elizabeth Farms, we were there already, yeah, they still, they're still have money after all these generations.
Yes, I was curious, hearing Becky's question and your answer made me think at Coleman Park, there is an agreement that if the city would ever give it up, it goes back to the Colemans. Is there any such agreement on this church, or does it belong to the church council, or how does that work?
No, there's no agreement like that. The Colemans did not donate the land like they did at Coleman's Park. They gave money from which the church bought land and built properties.
Okay.
Yeah, in the Episcopal Church, it's a little complicated as to whether the local parish owns the land or the diocese owns the land. I don't think the parish could do much without the diocesan approval, but it's the church that owns the land. It's not, there's no red rose every year or anything to the Colemans for that donation.
I don't want to miss anyone. Okay, well, thank you so much. Let's give him a round of applause.
If anyone does want to take a tour of the church, I'll be happy to give a tour afterward.
And also, we have a donation here for the organ fund at St. Luke's.
Thank you.
For your presentation today, and to say thank you. Your knowledge is really outstanding. Thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.